Hello, and on this week's episode of To All the Books I Have Read Before, we're going to be discussing some works by female authors that we have covered in our English um, 2, 3, 4, 3 class. So, do we want to start us off with some questions or?
Oh yeah, first, we're going to be going over some Harriet Jacobs, and I'll be asking some questions about Frances Harper's poems, and Angelina Weld Grimké's Rachel. So first things first, would you consider your text to be feminist pieces? If so, what categorizes them as feminist?
So I would say that any piece really concerned with the situation and position of women in society, as well as those pieces that cover simply the lived experience of women, would be considered essentially feminist, as they give voice to a traditionally marginalized group. I would also say that any piece concerned with politics of equality or establishing an innate equity between all people, men, women, and gender nonconforming individuals is essentially feminist as well. And I think we absolutely see feminism in these pieces, and as they draw upon our empathy for women, whether that be in Harriet Jacobs' fight for her freedom, or through Harper's poetry about slave mothers, or in Rachel, where we see the harrowing nature of racism as it prompts Rachel to make a decision to sacrifice her happiness to protect and yet negate the future of her children. And so, when drawing on our ability to connect and empathize with these female protagonists, Jacobs, Harper, and Grimke are reminding us of the inherent equality between people, even if society has and continues to ignore that. I would also say that these are feminist pieces for the virtues it exalts in the women portrayed. For example, Jacobs in Incidents in the Life of a Slave Girl, though having felt pressure to submit to her master, resisted. And what readers might deem as a heroic victory, I know that it's hard to read that and not feel a little bit of satisfaction. And furthermore, the sheer courage and perseverance and integrity she exhibited when not only escaping to the north but refusing to have her freedom bought is inspiring to us. And in Harper's poetry, we see feminine strength and resolve in Eliza Harris's determination to escape to slavery with her child, with the alternative being death. In learning how to read, we see a 60-year-old former slave commit herself to learning how to read, and then she succeeds affording herself her own sense of independence and dignity. She likens herself to a queen on a throne. So I think that's pretty cool. And then in Rachel, we see virtues such as kindness, love, dignity, strength, charity, morality, exemplified by both Mrs. Loving and Rachel in their treatment of other people, but specifically their love for each other and for Jimmy, whom they adopt and treat as their own.
Yeah, I completely agree with all of those. So we talked briefly in class about the concept of Alice Walker's feminism being to feminism as purple is to lavender. How would you conceptualize this metaphor in the scope of the text that you're covering?
So I love this metaphor, and I think that the concept of womanism is incredibly applicable to the text, and is especially important to touch on in a conversation of the feminist implications of these texts, because even though feminism is largely considered a politics of equality, it's historically been centered on the equality of white women and has largely excluded Black women and women of color. What I find fascinating about this metaphor is that Walker poses womanism as being broader and therefore more inclusive than the feminist movements that we've seen through history. And then I found a definition from Duke University's website a couple of days back that outlines some of the facets of womanism that I think are interesting to consider. So, womanist is from womanish, of girlish, i.e., frivolous, irresponsible, not serious. A Black feminist or feminist of color, from the Black folk expression of mothers to female children, you acting womanish, i.e., like a woman, usually referring to outrageous, audacious, courageous, or willful behavior, wanting to know more and in greater depth than is considered good for one, interested in doing grown up things, acting grown, being grown up, interchangeable with another Black folk expression, you trying to be grown, responsible, in charge, and serious. And I just think it's so interesting because all of these traits that are posited as being in line with irresponsibility, like such as being outrageous and audacious and courageous and willful, are traits that have aided the women in the text that I'm covering in their success. Eliza Harris and Jacobs comes to mind, and it helps them sort of succeed in their attainment of independence and freedom. And something also interesting to me is that womanism includes wanting to be grown, which I think we see in Rachel to some extent in her desire to become a mother. And in doing so, womanism sets up this tacit reverence for mothers and motherhood, which is also present in all the works that I've touched on. We see Harriet Jacobs exalting her grandmother and her mother as sort of saintly figures, and she herself protecting the sanctity of motherhood by securing a future for her and her daughter.
Yeah. So you talk about the exclusion of Black women and women of color in the feminist movements, which ties into the concept of intersectionality, which tries to address the way that Black women have fallen through the gaps of both civil rights and feminist movements. How do we see intersectionality, the convergence of multiple oppressions affect the women in the works you were covering, especially as it pertains to mothers?
Yes, so in all the texts we've covered, there's an anxiety attached to Black motherhood that would not be present in models of white motherhood. We see this in Harriet Jacobs, who summarized the sentiment by the statement, slavery is terrible for men, but it is far more terrible for women. Super added to the burden common to all, they have wrong sufferings and mortification, particularly their own. Likewise, in the selection of poetry by Harper, we see the two depictions of slave mothers. And something to note here is that the burden of protection and grief largely falls upon the mother. This is due in part to the ambiguous paternity that we talked about in class with the child of Eliza Harris, presumably belonging to and being fathered by the white slave master. But I would also argue that this responsibility and anguish falls largely on the mother because of the way that society genders concepts such as protection and nurturing, and we sort of the way that we've connected that those virtues with cis women's ability to reproduce. And then going back to intersectionality as it pertains to Black mothers, it's important to note that oppressions resulting from womanhood and the oppressions resulting from Blackness are intertwined and cannot be separated and anatomized.
Oh, yeah, completely. You can make the argument that both incidents of in the life of a slave girl and Rachel take the form of Bildungsroman. In what ways does the idea of coming of age enhance or add to the themes touched on in the two works?
Yeah, I completely agree that they're both pieces relaying a coming of age and a growing into Black womanhood and the societal restrictions and implications that entails for both Rachel and Jacobs. Something I think is pretty interesting is that we could connect the experience of adolescence as a whole to the idea of liminality. It's a time of betwixt and betweenness where there's no real clear definitions as to what and who the individual is. There's nothing that we can say to really define for ourselves who we are definitively. And I think that's, it's terrifying, but it's also, a space for freedom. As adolescents, we're clumsy and we're stripped down to a point where we can build ourselves back up again and define for ourselves who we are and what that means. This isn't without growing pains. And we see this in Jacob's regret of having her affair with Sands. She says, I wanted to keep myself pure, and under the most adverse circumstances, I tried hard to preserve my self-respect. I was a poor slave girl, only 15 years old. And in that quote, we sort of see the room with which we allow white people and white adolescents, white youth to grow into their adulthood, to make mistakes and to come back up for them, whereas the consequences for Black youth are much more severe. In Rachel, the coming of age is more the realization that this beautiful power and potential for human creation that she holds within herself is due to the racial climate of the time. It sort of devolves into a moral quandary where she ultimately decides that it's not worth the trouble. The way that the structure of the Bildungsroman works here is that it poses a very terrifying question, like what do you do when the growing pains don't subsist when you get into adulthood, but only evolve to include the terrifying revelations of racial inequity and injustice. It adds ever more to our feelings of indignance because we naturally expect adulthood to be free of the same insecurities and uncertainties present in adolescence. And what I think Grimké is saying here is that this isn't a luxury afforded to Black youth in America who are forced to grow up a lot faster than white youth are.
Yeah.
All right. And then I have some questions to ask you about your pieces because you are covering Chopin's The Awakening, The Story of an Hour, and Desiree's Baby. So yeah, so like the first question I have for you is just like, what did you think about those pieces? Did you enjoy them? And sort of like your general thoughts on those.
Yeah, I think Chopin is a just an artist with like the way she writes. And I remember reading the story of an hour, and I in the preface it said that she was kind of forgotten until the awakening. And I think that's so sad because I enjoyed the story of an hour and Desiree's Baby so much, like just the concepts of like in the story of an hour, how Miss Mallard like she was so still grieving over her husband's death, but she was also like happy in a way. Like she was so happy that whenever she realized he wasn't dead, she died. Like she was just so in shock. And I feel like most people, like, while yes, they would be in shock, they would also just be like, thank God, like he's alive. And she was not that way. Like her freedom was taken away from her in a little bit of a sense. And I liked how in Awakening, she was just so thorough in like how Edna was like not the coming of age, but in the sense coming of age of her freedom without her husband, kind of because he was a burden to her at first, and then like she was just getting closer with Robert. And I just like the sense of the awakening as a whole, like the concept completely. And in Desiree's Baby, I just really liked how, I mean, it's really sad, but I like to see how some people view like men in that time and even now, and how they think that they have to ask for like acceptance or permission. And I think that that is just a really interesting concept, because I think that that evaluated and evolved in a really interesting manner like to now. But yeah, I
Absolutely.
really like Chopin as a writer, just completely.
And her style is just beautiful as well. So I guess
Yeah.
the first question after that I would like to posit to you is, would you consider these feminist pieces? And if so, what sort of makes them feminist?
Yeah, I think just like going back to the awakening, I see like the most prominent feminist kind of acts in the awakening, because she's finding out who she truly is. Edna is without her husband, and like I was saying, her husband is a little bit of a burden to her, which is interesting because I know some people now still fall into that category. And she just goes out, and whenever she begins the awakening, like in herself, she just finds her independence. She finds her own um like just her own true self without anybody else. And then I know Robert and Adele are helping her with that, but she's just finding who she truly is, and spending that time on herself. And I think that is like that's just a big step for feminism, because like she was doing that for herself. She wasn't doing that for anybody else, like no man. But and then I think how Miss Mallard like responds to the news of her husband's death, how like she feels free. And so I think I don't think I would consider this a feminist piece. I think it definitely like brings attention to the roles and like the stress that the just like everyday burdens can have on women versus men. Like while they are can be stressed from work, or they do like feel the burden of financial situations on their shoulders, I think that women feel the burden of a lot more. And that like can stem from the men in their lives and like their husbands. And like she just felt so free. And that's really sad, because I know that a lot of people do that. A lot of people are like, oh yeah, like I don't know, it's just a sense of freeness. And then when he comes back, she just saw all of that basically being taken away from her. And so I think that it definitely like draws attention to like feminism, but I don't think I would consider it like to be towards a feminist like movement or anything. Same kind of goes for Desiree's Baby. She's still asking for that like permission, and from she's asking him for permission to leave because he accused her of not being white. And he in the end we find out that he was the one who was not who he said he was. And he was just, we don't get to see his reaction of that, which I wish we did. But I think that that plays a big role. Like she just left it up to him. And I think that's kind of like the opposite direction. But if I had to like rate them, like I would definitely like going towards like the feminist movement, I would definitely say like Desiree's Baby, and then like we're getting a little closer with a story of an hour, and then it's like The Awakening. It's like we're here, but that's how I
Absolutely.
see that.
Yeah, no, I love that. And so you know you're talking about these feminist implications of these stories, and considering Desiree's Baby and as well as Awakening, we see this motif of suicide. What do you think this motif of suicide at the end of the story or stories contributes to the themes that we pull from these stories?
Yeah, I think that Desiree's like her attention to ask him and kind of her sadness because she just had to, I don't know how to say this. She just kind of had to deal with the fact that he was right and she was wrong. And I think that that's a really hard thing to take, especially with an accusation in that time of like local color. I think that the accusation of that, she couldn't have taken that lightly. And she was like, oh, maybe it is me. Like, do you want me to leave? And so the motif just adds that much more like seriousness. And we see it directly whenever Miss Mallard dies to the reaction of her husband being alive. Like, no, it's not a direct like suicide, but I do think that she was just unhappy in her marriage and just had all of these specific things that she had to do every day, and it wasn't a happy, healthy marriage. It was more of like a commitment she had to do and something, one more thing that she had to like add to her plate. And so I think that the like motif of suicide um is just, it's really prominent, and it kind of adds that more sincerity and like not more at risk, but it's like, oh wow, like Miss Mallard died at the end of the story, you know, like and then Desiree leaves her own, like establishes her own kind of like dying to Armand. He's just like, nope, this is how it is, you're leaving, and she's dead to him, and she had to like take the baby with her. And I think that that's just kind of the whole suicide motif just adds a little bit more of um like surrealness to the stories. And I think Chopin did this because women weren't being taken seriously, and they were like kind of brushed off, and I think she was wanting to bring it more to the table of like, this is serious, like we need to be listened to, kind of going back to like the feminist point of view. But
Absolutely. Something you brought up that I thought was so interesting is that, you know, you rate these texts according to which one's least feminist, and then which one's most feminist. And, you know, when I first considered the implications of suicide at the ends of these stories being, you know, Desiree's Baby and The Awakening, I thought, you know, like how can it be feminist if you know the protagonist dies, you know, and then chooses to die, elects to die. And then you brought up the idea that Desiree was almost dead in Armand's eyes already. So it's almost as if she did not commit suicide herself. That was more being pushed by the external circumstances, most explicitly articulated by Armand's rejection of her. So that's not even it's interesting to consider that that's not even a suicide at all, but a sort of like progression of events, and you know these sort of inevitable antecedents, and then Mallard sort of, you know, going up from there. You know, no, it's not a suicide, but you know her heart was broken because of all of the ways that she internalized this freedom that she was going to have, and then her hopes being let down. And then something interesting to consider is that Edna 100% chose that for herself. And you know, like suicide's never easy to talk about, and it's never going to be a light subject to talk about, but in considering it in line with the feminist agenda and the sort of acquisition of agency, we could argue that the end of it was her own choosing. She was choosing in the same way that we all have the right to choose how we live. We choose how we end our lives, maybe. And so maybe that was Edna's own sort of her establishing her agency, saying, no, this is enough, I'm done, this is the end. So I thought that was incredibly interesting. And then I think it also, you brought up the idea of being in these really restrictive situations. So I wanted to pose a question. What does the main dynamic look like in regards to roles of white women in the household? And, you know, what are their roles in regards to their marriages to their husbands?
I think that there seems to be, like you said, a sense of restriction, and there's just so much, not even when we think of marriages now and like finding like a family, we think of happiness. Like whenever I think of the future and like having a family, I'm like, oh, that's gonna be so fun. Like I don't think, oh, like that's just one more thing or one more person I'm gonna have to take care of. And I think that's how Edna really saw like her marriage in the beginning of the awakening, and she saw it more as a chore and more as something restricting her from being her best self and being her truest self. And I think we see that in all of these stories, and Chopin really she really highlights that, especially in the story of an hour. It's just really blunt. Like she had so much stress and just so much, so many. I don't even know the word that I'm looking for. Just commitments, and she had so much to deal with, and her husband being dead like has, as brutal as that sounds, it kind of takes those away from her, and like it takes those restrictions, and it made her a free woman. And not even in the sense of like she couldn't do anything while her husband was there. She just, that was one less person that she had to like stress about, and she could just really focus on herself. And now that I'm like going through this and saying these things, that I really do think that like feminism is really prominent in all of these like stories and all of her Chopin's work, um all of her like pieces, because like even that, just like being able to choose yourself over like somebody else, and like as a woman that was not really like well known at that point in time. And um we often still put ourselves last, and um we, it's just something that we default to, I think. But in the story of an hour, she was just happy she could choose herself. Same in Awakening. And then in Desiree's Baby, it was more of like a um she was choosing herself in the end, I think, because like she did choose to take her own life, and like that was a conscious choice. And that was her herself just being like, okay, well, like this is, I kind of got away from the like
Oh no, that's all good.
but I think that, so like I think the dynamic though is really interesting, because like in the Awakening, let me regroup. Because in the Awakening we saw that she just has like, she has this commitment to their house, to her household, and she kind of strays from that. And I think that's like something we don't see a lot. And then in the story of an hour, she is committed to her household like 110%. And that's why, that's where I was getting to. It's like how she feels kind of like freed and lifted from that burden. And then in Desiree's Baby, we just see how um like in roles of talking about marriage, how she is asking for his permission to leave, or if he wants her to leave. And she's basically like answering to him in a way, is how I see it. And so that's an interesting concept, in regards to like how loyal she has to be, or like how loyal they all have to be like to their household, and like just to their marriages. And um that's their main kind of purpose, which is really sad. And I think that's why I keep going off this like road to feminism, is because it's like that's their main purpose, and that's changing so much in our time. And we're seeing more of like how women can go to work and women can be the bread makers or whatever, and how men are more likely staying home. But in this time, like that's not how it was. And I think Chopin is just like really, really like bringing that and opening it up like for confrontation and perspective, kind of.
Absolutely. Yeah. And it is interesting to consider the ways in which feminism has evolved and feminist thought, and as well as that, the ways that misogyny has evolved to become a little bit more undetectable, and in that way a bit insidious. And then just taking both of our selections into account, we see a difference and a divide between the way that Black mothers teach their children versus how white mothers regard and teach their children. And so I was just wondering, like, what you had to say to that, and you know.
I think considering like your pieces, uh, Rachel was really prominent to me because we saw how she taught Jimmy, and how whenever she realized, whenever she first learned about how like Black kids were treated in schools, and like just this there's just always this, I think, this negative feeling that Black mothers have to feel, and they're like, I know I'm going to have this conversation with my kids at some point about how people won't treat us equally. And I think that's something that white mothers don't have to worry about. They have to teach them, obviously, like do good moral, like have good morals, do good in school and all that. But like, I think Black mothers just have a really have to teach their kids a lot more like respect, and I think they do this just out of precaution. And I think that the not the awakening, that Rachel just shows this directly. And even Rachel choosing not to have children, so that way she wouldn't bring like children into that world. You know what I mean? Like, that's just so big. And I think that every choice that a Black mother makes to choose, like to teach their children, matters. Like in everything that they do teach their children, it's going to play a part in how they like live their life. And I think that that just isn't on white mothers, and they don't have to like consider it as directly, in my opinion.
Absolutely. Touching on Rachel, there's this sense of constant anxiety that Mrs. Loving feels. We see that she sort of like blanks out and she zones out when, especially on the anniversary of her son's death. Um, and it's this acknowledgement of the fragility of the Black body and the way that society vilifies Blackness, and the way that Black youth aren't able to have that room to breathe, to be children, to play, to have fun without being chastised for it, whereas white children can do the same things and then some. I think there's a feeling of responsibility that Black mothers feel to teach their children about the racial climate of the times that they're living in, to preserve their children's lives. And I don't think that this is something, and I think that's what you touched on there, this isn't something that falls on white mothers, and so that these white children grow up with a little less awareness of the racial climate that they live in, and then they might perpetuate racial violence, racial injustice, because they didn't have that acknowledgement and that learning and that the education early on in their childhoods, which perpetuates this vicious cycle. And so another question I wanted to posit to you was that we see this idea of women as items of male conspicuous consumption addressed in the text by Black women, and by the text by Chopin. So, like, it's interesting to consider the sort of dynamic, and I was wondering like what you had to say about that.
I think, let me think on this one. Yeah, I see it in, I mean, every story I see, there's like a dynamic that kind of, as we were saying, like women as items like of male consumption. And I think that it happens, and in all of Chopin's stories it's prominent. And then in, I mean, all of the stories that you were covering and all of the texts, I see that it's really prominent too. Kind of going to, I feel like I'm like just kind of repeating myself, but it's just so prominent of that, like we have, all the women in these stories have this like responsibility to just answer to the men in their lives. And I think that seeing that as like the male consumption is like, even it's more prominent by the Black authors. And because they, like in Rachel, she felt like she had to, or in my opinion, she didn't like I forgot his name. She didn't like him at first. He was very like forward, and she was like, we'll all see you later. And he was like, no, I'll see you later. Like, not all of you, I'll see you. And so I think there's just a sense of answering to men and dealing with it. And there's a sense of the concept of just the social roles and in society that we still have today, but like way, way, way less than in these pieces and that we see in these pieces.
It's interesting because I actually saw it most in The Awakening with Edna's husband, like looking at her hand and being like, "Oh, my property's damaged. You went out into the sun and got like burned." Which also like brings into the idea of colorism and the idea that whiteness is privileged over being darker skinned or being having a bit of tint to your skin. Um, and it's also interesting to see the ways in which in the text that I've chosen, especially in Harriet Jacobs' autobiography, and in the poetry by Harper, is that these women they don't have a choice but to be considered items of consumption because of the atrocities of slavery and the ideas that their personhood was stripped from them. And I think it's also interesting to consider the ways in which this mentality sort of evolved today, because there's like this weird subculture where like especially boyfriends are um they're demanding that their girlfriends or forbidding their girlfriends from wearing a specific article of clothing because that's going to draw attention and other men are going to look at you and that's going to make me upset because that's a slight on my honor. And it's this like sickening and maddening, disgusting sort of casualization or like making casual of this objectification of women. And I hate it. It's a normalization of objectification of women, and I just don't like it. But as women today, we're sort of made to accept that and made to sort of just deal with that in any way that we can. And that burden shouldn't fall on us. Just like the burden of having to decide whether or not to have children shouldn't necessarily fall on Rachel. Just like the burden of having to protect her freedom shouldn't have to fall on Harriet Jacobs. That should be granted to her. And then just like Edna shouldn't have to be fighting to be seen as an equal to her husband or to have freedom in that marriage. So yeah, I think we see these concepts really sort of laid out in these pieces, however subtle. I mean, I guess with The Awakening, not very subtle, but not very subtly, but it's amazing to see that regardless of, or I guess support, in spite of the differences that race sort of requires in the experience of these women, every one of these like women authors is advocating for equality, is advocating for justice. And I think this extends not only to women, not only to white women, not only to Black women, but to like everyone, to women, to men, to gender nonconforming people. And it's comforting to know that there is this history of this evolution of feminist thought, and it's exciting to hope and to think of what feminists could hold in the future. So yes.
Yes, I was thinking the same thing. Like, I like your point of just, like you said, and I know even people that their boyfriends won't even like let them get tattoos and I'm like, that's not your, like, we are not your items. And I think that while we are, like, we have, those gender roles have changed over time and we have already seen that evolve a lot. Like you said, I'm just so excited to like see where it will go and like what's next. But I think it is like still kind of a default of answering to the men in our lives. It's like, oh yeah, like you said I won't wear it, so I won't wear it. And then it's like, no, I'm actually not gonna do that. I'm gonna wear whatever I want to wear. And then like I think it's just like the idea of it being a default is really sad. And like I try to do my part of like kind of changing my mindset. And all these stories just like really touch on it and just really like kind of a step in the right direction.
Absolutely. Well, this has been an amazing episode of To All the Books I Have Read Before. I'm excited for next week's episode, but I guess we'll just say goodbye to all the people tuning in.
Bye.